Okay, the title of this lecture is Who Goes to Prison? And unlike the photo in there of the very menacing-looking criminal, basically I'm going to pull on an article and use some of my own data that shows that it's actually not the hardened career criminal that the public imagines. That's not who we send to prison, believe it or not. So I pull from a chapter of a book that I've placed up on the web that you can see next to this lecture. So you should have read that first, please. So read it, take some notes, outline it, whatever, and then come back and watch this lecture, but keep it close to you so you can refer to it. I've also done some personal calculations to help bolster their argument. The premise of this lecture is that the public is probably unaware of who we send to prison. They, in fact, have the wrong image. It is my contention, and the authors from whom I draw this argument from, essentially it's their contention, and I agree with it, to be frank with you. The public thinks the following. Okay, they have certain myths about prisoners, if you will. One myth is that judges are soft on crime. They believe that our sentencing laws are so lackadaisical, so manini, if you will, in Hawaii, that most people get off many times from early offenses before they are, quote-unquote, finally sent to prison. The authors will show that's not untrue. People basically do, if you do a serious crime, you're going to be sent to prison almost immediately in the right way on a national basis. So people believe the second myth, if you will, is that they probably believe that we only send people to prison for very serious crimes. That's not true. We send people to prison for crimes that most of you and I would go, huh? We sent somebody to prison for that? And then the last myth is that, I should say, all people in prison are by vicious predators. That's not true. There are certainly some vicious predators in there, but not all of them are vicious predators. Next slide, please. Okay. Bureau of Justice statistics show that our incarceration rate in the U.S. has exploded since the early 1980s. Essentially, it's increased about 5 times. The incarceration rate is a better statistic to use than the raw numbers because they are essentially useless. But the incarceration rate is good because it takes into account the growth of our population. So if there are more Americans born, then our raw count of prisoners should go up, even if we don't change the percentage of percentage of Americans we send to prison. So that's why raw numbers suck, if you will. Okay, they're of little value. Think of the incarceration rate as the percentage of the U.S. population who is incarcerated. Okay, that per 100,000 part of an incarceration rate takes into account population growth and is thus a much more meaningful statistic than raw numbers. Okay, so next slide and I'll show you a picture of our incarceration. So you can see since 1980, our incarceration rate has grown tremendously. What is that? That's at least 4 times, almost 5 times. We'll go to so basically in 2004, our incarceration rate was 486,000 people. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit tired today. 486 per 100,000 U.S. residents. So that last slide, the picture showed that our incarceration was 486 per 100,000, but the real incarceration rate, if you will, everybody who we lock up, is much higher, 724,000. So the number on prisons, the number of people we incarcerate just in prisons, which is the previous slide, is pretty depressing. But if you look at everybody who's incarcerated, it's much higher, almost double that, if you will, to 724. So that's everybody locked up. Okay, back to Austin and Irwin. Okay, Austin and Irwin disagree with the myths out there about prison populations, and they actually go about to gather some data to support their view. Okay, their study sought to find out who is actually going to prison, the extent of their criminal involvement, the seriousness of their crimes, and the danger they pose to society. And they use both national level statistics from the Bureau of Justice Statistics and qualitative data they collected from 3 states. Essentially, they take a macro quantitative look, and then they use some mostly qualitative data, although it's collected with small random samples, if you will, from a few states in the U.S. It is very good real-world data, however. No data is perfect, but their quantitative data is, as good as it gets. And their qualitative data uses samples that are a bit small, but it's still very good data. Doing qualitative work is very, very time-consuming and hard to do. And lastly, probably the reason why they had to go out and collect their own data and keep such small samples is that their conclusions aren't politically correct. Unfortunately, the dirty little secret about studying crime in the U.S. is that we live in a world where the U.S. federal government indeed restricts the sort of research questions they will fund when it comes to crime and drugs. Essentially, researchers who seek projects that don't support the company line of the war on drugs and that we have to get tough on crime are very unlikely to be funded, and indeed they are blacklisted. That is absolutely true. I heard that from a nationally recognized scholar at a conference. I was talking to her. I said, "Hey, I tried to get my study funded, and I don't know how come I didn't get funded." And then when I explained to her my project, my project went against the company line that all drug users are evil and we need to be afraid of all of them and we need to incarcerate them. Thus, I didn't get funded. She goes, "And you shouldn't turn in another one like that because you'll probably be blacklisted." So that's the dirty little secret about crime research in the U.S. Okay, the big picture. Please excuse me, I'll take a couple of swigs from water as I do this lecture because your throat gets dry. Using national level data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, they argue that we are sending about the same number of people to prison over time. Those are new admissions or new commitments. But these people are serving longer sentences and violating parole more often. Okay, so you see the parole violators there. So the same number of people are coming in through the door to prison, but they are made to stay longer, and more of those who are released early are coming back due to parole violations. That's what accounts for the vast majority of our prison growth here from 1990 to 1997. Okay, we're not sending more new people to prison, meaning for a new crime. Okay, let me give you an example, if you can. Think of it this way. Pretend we let 20 people into a classroom and made them stay 5 minutes. And then, after 5 minutes, we're going to lend in another 20, but we're going to make them stay for 10 minutes. Then, after 5 minutes, we're going to send another 20 people in that classroom, and we're going to make them stay for 20 minutes. Okay, pretty soon you're going to have more people in the room than the classroom can hold. Okay, that should sort of make sense to you. Why? Because we're sort of sentencing them to longer stays in the classroom. We're saying you get to stay in the class. First it was 5 minutes, then it was 10 minutes, then it was 20 minutes. So think of that as our prison sentences are growing longer, except we're making you go into the classroom and we're making you stay longer. So one of the reasons why our prison system grew in the 1990s, we made the sentences longer. We made prisoners stay in the room longer, if you will. Another reason why our prison systems grew is that the number of people violating parole increased. Back to the classroom analogy again. Parole is essentially letting people out of prison early. But if they violate the conditions of their release, or parole, we send them back to prison. So go back to our crowded classroom, where we're letting people into the room every 5 minutes, 20 people every 5 minutes, but we're making them stay longer. Over time, the number of people in the classroom will grow. But let's also now pretend that we take some of those people who we let out after their sentences due, and we put them back in the room for not following conditions of their early release. Essentially, then you get the idea of how we're going to have a growing number of people in the room. Same idea, that's how our prison systems has grown. Okay, so again, to recap, from 1990 to 1997, the number of new court admissions or new commitments to prison remained essentially unchanged. But the number of parole violators and the length of the prison terms account for almost all the growth. Okay, so the daily prison population has increased 60% since 1990 for two reasons. I'm quoting from Austin and Irwin now. Namely, the number of parole violations have increased and the length of the prison terms. Okay, so while we're sending about the same number of people to prison over time, we're sentencing them to longer stays in prison, and we're turning more people to prison due to parole violations. Now, okay, the authors also argue that the public believes that our sentencing practices are essentially soft. So the myth out there is that people who are convicted of serious crimes are rarely locked up. They suggest that they don't agree of this notion that our system is soft on offenders. They say it's not true. So they say, well, the public believes that most criminals who are convicted of very serious crimes, they never get locked up, and they're essentially let off the slap on the wrist. Therefore, these hardened criminals continue to commit crimes because the penalties are so soft, and the logical assumption there is that the sentences for our crimes are not harsh enough. So to solve our crime problem, we need to get tough on these criminals and make stricter laws that mandate prison terms. They say, look, that's already happening. Okay? As a group, Austin and Irwin show that about 69%, that's almost 7 in 10 people of all convicted felons are incarcerated. And it's much higher when you look at very serious crimes, more like 3/4, 75%. And these figures don't include those who did jail time. Okay? Many people who have been locked up will tell you that jail time is much tougher time than prison time. Essentially, on the mainland, jails are funded by the counties. They don't have as much money as the state, so there's not as nice places to be. Okay, this is basically their supporting data that they provide. Okay, I take their national data from the book and I tweak it a little bit. I added a column to the table for the percentage of people sent to prison. So with my table, modified table here, you can see who went to prison only, okay, who went to jail. See, they have jail or prison in there, and that's not good. I want to know percent sent to prison and the percent incarcerated. Okay. So you know, jail sentences are typically less than a year. That's how people get sent to jail instead of prison. Basically, if you go to prison, you're going to go for more than a year. All right. At any rate, the numbers show that the vast majority of people are incarcerated and many are sent to prison. I don't expect you to memorize these numbers, but I do expect you to get the big picture. Okay, we incarcerate the vast majority of people convicted of felonies, especially violent ones. Okay, look at murder. Look at the percentage incarcerated, 94. 91% of them are sent to prison. I don't get that one on the murder, why that would drop like that. Robbery, 87% are incarcerated. 72% of them are sent to prison. I'm suspecting that Austin and Irwin didn't put this column of percentage sent to prison because I think they didn't support their argument as much. They're being a little bit biased there, I think. But what you see is that for the more serious the crime, the more likely it is for you to go to prison. And just because you only went to jail, okay, and you didn't go to prison, that doesn't mean you got off real easy. Okay, but as you would expect, people are sent to prison for more serious crimes. The other thing I would have liked to have seen is more than 1 year's worth of data. It would make, if their argument held for many years, not just one, it would make their argument stronger and more intellectually compelling. But they only provide us with 1 year. So that's not as good as if we were to see 10 years worth or 20 years worth. Okay, Austin and Irwin also demonstrate that over time we're locking up a startling number of drug users. In 1960, it was only 5% of prison admissions were for drug crimes. In 1991, it almost doubled to 9%. But if you look at 1996, that's 15 years later than 1981, it was 30% of all new courted commitments were sent to prison for drug-related offenses. Now, this is most serious offense. Okay, so that was their most serious offense. Okay, these are my calculations from a different lecture. But it bolsters this point that we are devoting more and more of our prison resources to locking up drug offenders. Look at the bottom row that's in tan or yellow. That gives you the proportional growth of prisoners by the most serious offense over the last 20 years of the 20th century, okay, from 1980 to 1999, okay? People under so the important thing to realize here is this is by most serious offense. Okay, that means people under drug crimes were not convicted of hurting someone, which would be a violent offense. Robbery is included as a violent offense because it's psychologically damaging. Robbery is I see you, you see me, and I take something from you. But anyway, people under drug crimes were not convicted of hurting someone, which would be a violent offense, or stealing from someone, which would be a property offense. These are drug crimes only. Okay. If you go to the website on the bottom, I give you an explanation of what each of the categories include. But essentially, in plain English, what this table means is we are devoting more and more of our prison resources to the least dangerous types of people. And if our prisons continue to grow in this way, over time, the vast majority of prisoners will be there for drug and public order violations. Okay, I ask you to play the Sesame Street game with me. One of these things is not like the other. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, people who hurt people and steal from people are more dangerous than people who use drugs and don't hurt and don't steal from people. Same with public order offenses. Okay. That's my personal opinion. You're free to disagree with it. But I think most people would agree with me that people who hurt people and steal from people are worse criminals, more dangerous than people who just use drugs and don't hurt and don't steal from people. It costs us about $20,000 to $40,000 a year to send somebody in prison. In Hawaii, we send about half of our prisoners off to the mainland, and it still is around $30,000. I think we're at the high end in Hawaii. But anyway, because it costs so much, $20,000 to $40,000 a year, which does not include building the prison, by the way, that's just once you have the prison built. That's how much it costs you. Okay, this means that because we spend $20,000 to $40,000 a year to incarcerate somebody, that means that prison is a precious resource. Okay, and this table indicates that over time we're spending more and more of this precious resource on the least dangerous type of offenders. Personally, I think we should be locking up property and violent offenders at a greater rate than drug offenders and public order offenders. I think that's because they cause the most harm to society, violent and property offenders. Of course, you're free to disagree. You are free to disagree with my view of which crimes are the most serious. Okay, if you think drug crimes are more serious than violent crimes, that's fine. Even though the drug crime in this table, they did not do something violent. Okay, but you can't refute the numbers. We're spending a greater and greater proportion of our prison budgets incarcerating drug and public order offenders rather than violent and property offenders. That, to me, doesn't make sense. Okay, back to Austin and Irwin's data. They seek to sort of answer the question of how many prisoners are actually dangerous. To their credit, they acknowledge that certainly some felons are truly dangerous to the public and we want to incarcerate them. They do nasty things. And I agree with them. There are some people that deserve to be put in prison and need to be there for a long period of time. I think Austin and Irwin agree with that. However, they suspected that a good percentage of inmates don't fit our popular image of the hardened criminal, the dangerous criminal. Okay, so they set out to answer this question: who are we sending to prison? Are they actually dangerous? By doing a study to actually get numbers to support their argument. By the way, Irwin's an ex-con who actually served time in prison, so I think he has a different perspective on this, so he actually kind of can tell you a little bit more about than a criminologist like myself who's never done time in prison. Okay, to answer the question, what they did was they did a qualitative ethnography in the early 1990s where they interviewed 154 randomly selected male inmates who were part of the intake population from 3 states, Washington, Nevada, and Illinois. they make a pretty good argument that, you know, it's only 3 states, but these states are probably fairly representative of the nation as a whole, and it's a pretty good argument. They purposely selected inmates rather intakes from their intake populations for a very good reason. Okay, essentially, it makes for a better study. By the way, qualitative data, what they do are stories. They collect stories. Quantitative data, those are numbers. Okay, so one of the reasons why they did qualitative research here is that it's very time-consuming, but it's better in that it allows for richer descriptions than qualitative surveys, if you will. At any rate, if you don't understand methodology very good, this is a pretty good study, and it's actually biased to the most serious offenders in these 3. Okay, again, it's an excellent study overall. Okay, their qualitative data, it's a very good qualitative data. They use random selection, even though most criminologists would like to see larger samples. They do qualitative research, which is very time-consuming and difficult to do. So in that sense, their smaller samples make sense. It's part of the real world. You just can't do larger samples because you don't have the resources to do it. That goes back to the point that they're not going to get funded by the federal government, and they don't have the resources to do more, to take larger samples. But qualitative data is more valuable, and it's a richer source than mere quantitative surveys. So with qualitative research, we get to hear the stories behind the numbers. Okay, so it's better in that sense. Okay, they randomly selected 154 males. They did males, not females, because males tend to be more serious. Okay, the intake population is people sent to prison directly from court. That means it's a new crime. Okay, and they purposefully selected intakes rather than daily counts done by the federal government because, here's a quote from page 24, surveys of the daily inmate populations provide a distorted picture of who is going to prison because those prisoners with longer sentences, usually sentenced for more serious crimes, stack up in the prison population and are overrepresented in one-day surveys. If you don't understand the methodology in that statement, it makes good sense. It's a good argument, and they improve their estimation of who is currently being sent to prison by doing their study in this way. Alrighty, so here's a little bit more on the methodology that they used. So they used a list of people that were admitted in the past 2 weeks to the prisons in those states, and they separated them into 5 categories based upon their most serious crime of conviction. Okay, so this is the most serious crime for which they did. So people who did a drug crime, for example, did not do a violent crime or a property crime as well. All they did was possession and trafficking. Okay, so that's a good methodological thing. One of the myths about drug criminals is, these drug criminals are doing all these other violent crimes and stuff as well, and that doesn't show up. Well, it does because they'd also be charged with the violent crime. Okay, so these are the 5 categories that they chopped them up into, and they put them in there. Okay, then these are sort of 5 basic categories of crime, so it's a good thing to do. And then so we have these 5 categories of crime, and then what they do is they randomly select 10 persons from each category in 3 states. So that's 30 people in total. Okay, and then they excluded women and parole violators who were not convicted of a new felony. This means their sample is skewed toward the person who committed the most serious crimes. The reason why they exclude women is because women don't tend to commit violent crimes like men do, and they wanted to just look at who is currently being sent to prison. Are we sending away nasty people or not? Remember, that's the goal here. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then they take each of their crimes and they classified the seriousness of the inmates' crimes using a very large 52,000 people in 1980 were interviewed on a survey, and they asked the American public to rate the seriousness of certain crimes. So this is good because it doesn't just take one person's opinion of what's a moderate crime, what's a serious crime, what's a very serious crime or petty. It took 52,000 people and they used their definitions, right? So this is a better, this means bias isn't possible by the researchers. they don't get to impose their own definition. Please, again, excuse me when I take a drink like that, but my mouth gets dry when I narrate these. Okay, so moderate crimes are acts that involve a minor injury, threat of injury, theft over $1,000, use of a weapon, use of heroin, and selling of marijuana. Serious crimes. I won't actually read all these for you right now, but because you see them in the actual article that you've read already. Okay, so the thing is that they take the people who were intake, part of the intake population. Remember, they had 30 people, and they say, okay, we'll get a description of their crime, what they did, and we'll put it in one of these categories based upon these definitions that the American public thinks. What do they say are moderate crimes? What do they say are serious crimes, etc. So now we'll be able to take those 30 people and say, oh, okay, you committed a serious crime, you committed a petty crime, you committed a moderate crime, etc. Okay, and we're using not the researchers' definitions, but a very, very large sample of Americans. Okay, so this is a good way to test who are we sending away to prison, and what would the average American think of the crimes we are actually sending away people to prison for? Are they very serious crimes, or are they petty? Remember, their contention is most Americans think that the only people we send to prison are people who do very serious things. Okay, so let's see what... Okay, basically what they found is that most people being sent to prison do not fit our image of the hardened criminal or violent thug. A good number of them are both inept criminals and social derelicts who do not hurt people and profit very little from their criminal endeavors. Let's go to the next slide. That's a general description. Okay, 52%, that's just over half, were sent to prison for what most Americans would call a petty crime. Moderate crimes, about 30% were sent for moderate crimes. So if you sort of look at those numbers, they get smaller as the crime gets more serious. So one way to look at that is over 80% of people sent to prison on a new offense are being set for what most of the public would term a petty or moderate crime. Only what's 13 in 5? That's about 18%. So less than 20%, less than 1 in 5 new prisoners being sent to prison are there for a very serious crime or a serious crime, what the public would deem as a very serious crime. So I ask you to sort of play the Sesame Street game, if you will, and say there's a Sesame Street song that would go, one of these things does not go with one of these things is not like the other. So I sort of say that, wow, when I look at this, this is not what I would expect. It's the exact opposite. I would think that we would reserve prison for the people who do the most serious crimes. Also, just as a side note, these percentages don't add up to 100 because they adjusted their samples. It's a methodological thing, but you can read it in their footnote if you want. So don't sweat that part. Okay, the main thing I want you to get here is, wow, this doesn't really make sense. I put this in a graphical thing for those of us who like to see pictures rather than tables. Sometimes people see tables and numbers and they get freaked out. Here's another way to look at it. Okay, basically the vast majority of people are being sent for what the public would deem a petty or moderate crime. Okay, so it doesn't seem like a very good use of a very expensive resource, prison. Prison's a very expensive resource. It costs us about $20,000 to $40,000, depending on where you are in the nation, to house and feed a prisoner. And that does not include building a new prison. One of the reasons why we've never built a new prison in Hawaii and we keep sending people away to the mainland is it would cost a whole bunch of money. It costs a lot of money to build one prison bed. Now, you're free to disagree with me, but my contention and the author's contention is this: wow, prison's a really expensive resource. We should reserve it for people who are truly dangerous, and we want to lock them up so they don't hurt the public. And it seems kind of backwards to me. Now, you're free to disagree with that if you want, but it just doesn't make logical sense to me. I would think that we'd want to send people away for what most of us would think are serious and very serious crimes. Seems backwards to me. But again, I don't want to push my viewpoint on you. Basically, what these numbers do suggest, though, and you can't argue this, is that most people being sent to prison in the 1990s don't fit our stereotype of the typical criminal. Just over half were sentenced for petty crimes, 30% for moderate crimes, only 13% for serious crimes, and just over 5% for very serious crimes. Again, these are people from 3 states. We need to be cautious about that. It would be better if we had more states. But again, this is at least data that's out there and that's been done. And if I had to pick 3 states, these are 3 pretty good states. Although, of course, I'd like to see California or Texas thrown in there. But in the real world, research is difficult to do. Probably the California prison systems and Texas said, no way, we're not letting you in. We know what kind of research you get. Okay, let's look at some of the descriptions of their crimes. First of all, they acknowledge that, to their credit, all right, that a small percentage of crimes were very serious, and these people should be locked up. So if you read pages 30 and 31, to their credit, they are very clear that they do believe that some people should be locked up, and some of these people did do very serious things. But what they claim is that most people sent to prison, and that's true, 52%, are what the average person would call a petty crime. Okay, the authors write on page 26, over half of the persons being sent to prison are being sent for petty crimes, which are crimes with no aggregating features, that is, no significant amount of money, no gain by the criminal, no injury to the person, or any other feature that would cause ordinary citizens to view the crime as particularly serious. I think that's a great statement for the data that they have. Okay, it's very accurate. Okay. Now they do, and then they actually tell you a few stories of petty criminals in the book, or in the chapter of the book that I've given you, and you should read those on pages 26 and 27 to get a feel of what 52% of the people being sent to prison, what the kinds of things that they do. I'll just briefly look at one for you. Nah, I'm taking too long. You guys just go and see that. Okay, they also claim, just sort of giving you a clue for the next thing, is that a large number of their moderate crimes were for cocaine sales and robbery, and they're probably not as serious as the public might think. Think about this, when they did that large survey, cocaine wasn't something they asked about. So they assume that selling cocaine would be sort of similar to selling heroin or something. And then they give us a few stories of these people who are moderate criminals in the book on page 29 and 30. And again, I don't want you to have to listen to me read it to you when you could actually go and read it. But there are some great stories that they put in the chapter. All right, next slide. The next thing that they do is they look at patterns of crimes. Okay, they wanted not only what crime did they do and what they were put in, what was their criminal history like before they got caught for this one crime? Were they doing a lot of crime? Were they doing a little bit of crime? What was going on? Okay, now the authors state that they think the public believes that most criminals are career criminals or high-rate offenders that need to be incapacitated. Incapacitated is a fancy word to say this. If you commit a lot of crimes, I'm going to put you in jail, and I'm incapacitating your ability to commit other crimes. I'm making it impossible for you to continue to victimize the public. And that's one of the major justifications for putting people away for long periods of time. So to test this theory, they developed 5 typologies from their qualitative interviews. Into crime, crime episode, being around crime, derelicts, one-shot crime. And they found the following. They describe the categories, by the way, in the book. But, I'm sorry, when I say book and chapter, that's the same thing. So just consider that to be, the same kind of thing. But, see what they are. Okay, into crime. You should read what that is on around page 33. Okay, but these are people who would, be doing a lot of crime. Okay, essentially, high-rate offenders. So about 43% of this description, the sample fit that description, and they're accurately described as high-rate offenders, and most had extensive criminal records. But, so these people were doing a lot of crime, but what they do say, so you are incapacitating them, okay, and that's a good thing. But they say, well, if you look at the qualitative descriptions of the crimes that these people actually commit, they do a lot of them, but these people are not especially talented criminals. Basically, they're losers, even in the criminal world. They can't even do that right. And they're not very talented or vicious criminals. So on page 33, they state, all of our data strongly suggests rather than being vicious predators, most were disorganized, unskilled, undisciplined, petty criminals who were very seldom engaged in violence or made any significant amount of money from their criminal acts. They're essentially losers. Okay? That's what. So these people who are into crime, that's who we're incapacitating. Now, I would imagine that there's also a few, very serious people too, who do very serious. All right, a crime episode. About 33 of the sample fit this description. These people have a less extensive criminal history than the into crime group, but more or less lived a conventional lifestyle, not a criminal lifestyle. Lived like you and me. But they got involved in a crime spree or a single crime that let them into their prison term. If you read some of those descriptions on page 34, you'll see, or page 33, you'll see that a lot of these are sort of crack binges and stuff like that. They mainly sort of, are good people, but they go on these little being around crime, about 18% of the sample fit this description. These are what are called corner boys, people who kind of hang out on the street, who are raised in high crime areas, and while they don't typically engage in criminal behavior themselves, they're around it all the time. And thus, they're sort of at risk of being swept up by these police patrols, and due to their attitudes against the system or the man, they're often treated by cops, prosecutors, etc., as if they are more serious criminals than they are. Now, to be honest, these corner boys also are responsible for that. When they get swept up by a cop, they're going to act just like a normal criminal because that's who they hang around with. They're going to have a defiant attitude, F you cop, da-na-na-na-na kind of a thing. So that's how they get swept up. But these people don't. These people are sort of like they had the wrong friend, if you know what I mean. And they say that while many of them are convicted of petty crimes, 68% of the sample, only a very small portion served a prison term as adult or a juvenile. So these people are not really career criminals at all. Next slide. Okay, derelicts. About 6% of the sample fit this description. These people are really losers. These men, they say, had completely lost the capacity to live in organized society. The crimes led to their incarceration were petty, but due to their extensive criminal histories and their disreputability, meaning, when you look at their rap sheet, when the judge looks at the rap sheet, when the cop looks at the rap sheet, when the prosecutor looks at the rap sheet, you go, these guys are losers, man. Their crimes land them in prison. It's mainly because of the priors, and they just sort of qualify by the way the law is written. But these are people who are truly institutionalized. They don't know how to operate in normal society, and they tend to have very serious drug and alcohol problems. To be frank, these are the sort of kids that I used to work with. I worked with kids that were one step away from being locked up in a mental hospital or being locked up in kiddie prison, and they'd been institutionalized. Many of them, they were teenagers, but many of them had been in institutions, for more than half of their life. So I imagine that these are sort of the people that those kids I used to work with grow up to be. They've never, ever lived outside of an institution. That's the only way they know how to act. But think about that, only 6%. A lot of the public has this idea that that's almost most of the people in prison. These people just like it better there, and so they just hang out there. They have TV, 3 hots and a cot. Why would they want to be anywhere else? So that is true for some, but only 6% of the sample. Okay? So I think the average American thinks there's a whole lot more people in prison that fit this description. Next. One-shot crime, that's just what it sounds like. 14% of the sample fit the description. These people are just what they sound like. This was their first crime. They did one act, that's what landed them in prison. Again, please read all these descriptions in the article. Okay, in conclusion, what I'd like to say, what I get from this article when I read it, and their conclusions from both as I wrote this lecture and when I read the article that's written, that I use a lot of the data. Basically, I come to the conclusions that they do. We're wasting a lot of money locking up very minor criminals who are not a serious danger to society. They also, to their credit, they say, hey, it's not just our study that shows this. They say that a number of studies, this is on page 47, that quote in front of you, a number of studies have also discovered that when respondents are given scenarios that are closer to the actual crimes of most people sent to prison, the majority recommend some punishment other than imprisonment. Collectively, these polls show that a majority of citizens would not recommend imprisonment for most of the people being sent to prison if they knew more about the offender's crimes and their life circumstances. So that's a quote that sort of says that basically other polls show the same things. If Americans knew more about which actual drug crime or which actual violent crime people were sent to prison for, they would say, well, actually prison's not appropriate for most of the people who we send there. We should do something else. So they're sort of saying that the public doesn't really know what sorts of criminals we're actually locking up in bars. So again, you don't go all the way the other way. They say, look, some of the people there in prison, maybe a good percentage, 30 or 20 or 30%, need to be there. They don't dispute that. But they say most of them don't. And most Americans would agree with us. So that's essentially what these show. The vast majority of people admitted to prisons are low-rate offenders who commit petty crimes. And even the high-rate offenders tend to commit very unskilled, unprofitable crimes, as they say on page 46. Essentially, they argue that we're wasting our money and making our crime problem worse in the long run by sending so many people into prison. Okay, how does that happen? Well, basically, you send somebody to prison. What do they learn? Do they get rehabilitated? No, it's a not awful, nasty place. They learn to be better criminals. It's such a violent, horrible place. What they end up doing is they become institutionalized, and then when they get out, it's almost like sending somebody into the jungle, the worst violent place you can imagine. And then, okay, when you get out in 10 years, we want you to act normal and integrate into society. So sending some people to prison actually makes them worse. Okay, so it makes our crime problem worse in the long run by sending petty criminals who don't profit and aren't especially violent in with the truly violent people. That's essentially their argument, and I agree there. So one way to look at it, just to recap, is that, wow, we're spending a whole lot of money on incarcerating a whole lot of people who probably don't need to be there. And we should spend that money on the truly dangerous and incarcerate them. Now, if you agree with that line of reasoning, that means you got to put up with these sort of derelict people that are out there going to be, stealing your car stereo and etc. But one way to look at it as well, I would say, no, I don't want my car stereo stolen. I personally had my bike stolen about 10 times when I was a kid, and that was a pain, and it pissed me off. But, okay, here's the other question. If I'd have known this, my gut reaction is send those people to prison. They didn't buy that. They should know better, and they should be punished. And I do believe that. They should be punished. However, what I ask myself now as a taxpayer, do I want to pay $20,000 to $40,000? That's minimal. That doesn't count any of the court costs. But I want to pay $20,000 to $40,000 of my money to have them locked up where they get 3 hots in a cot? My answer now is heck no. I want them out there living that stupid life of theirs. I don't want to waste my money. I don't want to spend $20,000. That's the cost of a college education to lock up people who are derelicts. Alrighty, that's the end.